Have you ever wondered how an entire empire could vanish without the thunder of conquest, without the drama of battlefield glory? How does a civilization that once commanded the wealth of continents simply fade into the administrative fog of ledgers and treaties, dissolving so quietly that those living through it barely notice the transformation? Tonight, we drift back to a strange and melancholy era, the mid-18th century in India, when the Mughal Empire still existed in name but had begun its long, silent collapse. This is not a story of sudden invasion or dramatic battle, though battles occurred. This is the story of something far more subtle, the slow replacement of one world by another, carried out through paperwork, routine, and the patient accumulation of small advantages. We'll walk through dusty markets where coins still bore the emperor's face, but his authority meant nothing. We'll stand in courtyards where nobles recited poetry while their estates crumbled. We'll watch as strange men in wool coats appeared at river ports, carrying ledgers thicker than swords, reshaping a subcontinent without ever raising their voices. Before we step into this quiet journey through India's long twilight, I invite you to tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these late-night passages through forgotten corners of the past will always find you. Leave a comment if you wish. Tell me where you are in the world right now, what hour it is where you're listening, whether you're wrapped in the stillness of deep night or just beginning your day. Now let the room around you grow a little darker. Perhaps switch on a gentle fan for that soft, steady hum that carries the mind elsewhere. Settle yourself comfortably, for we have a long road ahead, a road that winds through the fading Mughal world and into the quiet rise of the company that would inherit it all. Imagine yourself in a village along the Ganges, perhaps in Bengal or Awadh, during the 1760s. The year doesn't matter much. One year bleeds into the next, with little to distinguish them except whether the monsoon came early or late, whether the tax collector was cruel or merely indifferent. You wake before dawn, as you always do, because there is simply too much work to compress into daylight hours alone. The air is already thick with moisture, clinging to your skin like a second garment you cannot remove. Through the gaps in your hut's thatch roof, you can see the sky beginning its slow transition from black to deep blue, that brief window before the heat descends. Your sleeping mat is thin, worn through in places where your body has pressed against it night after night for years. Rising means feeling the familiar protest of muscles that never fully rest, the dull ache in your lower back that appeared sometime in your 20s and has never left. You move carefully in the darkness, trying not to wake the children sleeping nearby, their small bodies curled against each other for warmth, even in this humid air. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, uneven and cool against your soles. During the monsoon, it turns to mud, and you spend days trying to sweep water out the door, fighting a battle you can never win. During the dry season, dust rises with every step, coating everything, your clothes, your food, your lungs. Your first task is always the same, grinding grain. The stone grinder sits in the corner, heavy and unchanging, a tool your grandmother used, and perhaps her grandmother before that. You kneel before it, feeling your knees press into the earth, and begin the circular motion that will occupy the next hour. Push, circle, push, circle. Your arms falling into the rhythm automatically, your mind drifting, because there is nothing new to think about this task. The grain resists, as it always does. You can feel it breaking down gradually under the pressure, transforming from seed to flour, grain by grain. Your shoulders burn with the effort, but you don't stop. If you stop, there will be no bread. If there is no bread, your family will go hungry. The chain of consequences is simple and unbreakable. Through the doorway, you can hear the village beginning to stir. A rooster calls from somewhere nearby, though its timing seems arbitrary. Sometimes it crows at true dawn, sometimes hours earlier, as if it too has lost track of order and routine. You hear the soft murmur of voices from neighbouring huts, the scrape of other stones grinding other grain, the morning coughs that afflict everyone during the dusty season. The smoke from your cooking fire begins to fill the small space, making your eyes water. There is no chimney, only the gaps in the thatch through which the smoke escapes slowly, reluctantly. Every dwelling in the village produces this same smoke each morning, and by the time the sun rises fully, a grey haze hangs over everything, smelling of wood and dung and daily survival. You step outside to fetch water, carrying the clay pot that has been in your family longer than you've been alive. The path to the well is worn smooth by countless feet over countless years, a shallow groove in the earth that fills with water when it rains and becomes treacherous with mud. This morning it's merely dusty, and the dust rises in small clouds with each step, coating your ankles white. The well is communal, shared by perhaps 50 families, and there is an unspoken order to its use. You wait your turn behind 2 other women, neither of whom speaks. What would there be to say? You've known each other all your lives, lived through the same seasons, the same struggles. Words would only state what everyone already knows. When your turn comes, you lower the bucket carefully, hearing it splash into the water far below. The rope is rough against your palms, worn smooth in some places and frayed in others. You pull hand over hand, feeling the weight of the water growing heavier as it rises, your arms protesting but obedient. The bucket breaks the surface and you pour its contents into your pot, watching the water slosh and settle. The water itself is brownish, never truly clear. You've never known clear water, it's simply the colour water is, carrying with it the taste of earth and whatever else washes into the well during rains. You drink it because there is no other water. When someone in the village falls ill with fever or flux, everyone knows it might be the water, but knowing changes nothing. Walking back to your hut with the full pot balanced on your head requires a particular skill, learned young. You move with a steady, gliding gait, your spine straight, your neck taking the weight. After years of this, your neck has grown strong, your posture adapted to the burden. You barely think about it anymore, it's simply how you move through the world. Inside again, you use some of the water to cook rice, a small amount because rice is expensive and your family cannot afford to eat it at every meal. More often you eat millet or barley, cheaper grains that fill the stomach without satisfying. The rice is saved for days when there's something to celebrate, though such days have become increasingly rare. As you cook, you think about the list of tasks ahead. After breakfast, if you can call the small portion of gruel breakfast, there is weaving to be done. You work a loom in the corner of your hut, producing cloth that a merchant will come to collect every few weeks. The pay is almost nothing, calculated to keep you just barely able to continue, never enough to save, never enough to escape the cycle. The cloth you weave is cotton, fine and time-consuming to produce. Each thread must be placed with care, each pattern followed exactly, or the merchant will reject it and you'll receive nothing. Your fingers have grown calloused from this work, the skin hardened into leather-like patches. Sometimes a thread catches on the rough skin and breaks, and you have to tie it off and start again, losing time you don't have. You weave for hours in the dim light of the hut, your back bent, your eyes straining. There is no window to provide better light. Windows are a luxury for houses with something worth stealing. The only illumination comes from the doorway, and you position yourself to catch as much of it as possible, though the angle is never quite right. Outside, you can hear the sounds of village life continuing. Children playing in the dirt, their laughter brief and sporadic. Goats bleating as they're led to whatever scrub they can find to eat. Men calling to each other, usually complaints about the heat, about the work, about the taxes. Always the taxes. The taxes have become a constant source of anxiety, a shadow that hangs over every harvest, every small profit. You're not entirely sure who you're supposed to pay anymore. There is the zamindar, the local landlord, who sends his collectors regularly, but there are also men who claim to represent the Mughal authorities, though the emperor is far away in Delhi and might as well be in another world. And recently there have been other men speaking a language you don't understand, working for something called the company. Each group of collectors insists that their tax is the legitimate one, and each threatens consequences if you don't pay. You pay what you can to whoever seems most dangerous at the moment, trying to distribute your meager resources in a way that keeps everyone merely dissatisfied rather than vengeful. It's an impossible calculation, and you know that one day you'll guess wrong and face consequences you cannot afford. The confusion about authority is not new, but it has grown worse in recent years. When you were a child, the order of things seemed clearer. The Mughal emperor ruled, the provincial governors enforced his will, the zamindars collected his taxes. It was a system you might have questioned the fairness of, but at least you understood it. Now the system has fractured into competing claims, and no one seems certain who actually holds power. Rumors circulate constantly through the village, carried by travelers and merchants. You hear that the emperor in Delhi is elderly and powerless, controlled by various nobles who fight among themselves. You hear that the nawabs in Bengal and Awadh have stopped sending tribute to Delhi, declaring themselves effectively independent. You hear that the company, this strange organization of foreign traders, has begun collecting taxes in some regions, replacing the traditional collectors with their own men. None of these rumors can be verified, and they shift constantly, each new traveler bringing a slightly different version. The effect is a kind of political vertigo, a sense that the ground beneath your feet is shifting in ways you cannot see or understand. You know only that the old certainties have dissolved and nothing stable has replaced them. Around midday, you take a brief rest from the loom to prepare the main meal. This usually consists of flatbread, some vegetables if they're available and affordable, perhaps a small amount of lentils. Meat is rare, reserved for festivals that come only a few times a year. Your children have grown up on this diet, and you can see in their thin frames the evidence of chronic insufficiency. Not quite starvation, but never quite enough. As you cook, your mind wanders to the larger worries that plague you constantly. The monsoon was late this year, and the fields yielded less than expected. The price of salt has risen again, controlled by someone who holds a monopoly you don't understand. The merchant who buys your cloth has started paying less, claiming the market has changed, offering no further explanation. Each of these problems individually might be manageable, but together they create a pressure that never releases. You lie awake at night running calculations in your head. If you eat less, can you save enough to buy seed for next season? If you work the loom longer hours, will your eyes hold out? If you borrow from the moneylender, can you ever repay? Or will you simply be adding another creditor to the list of people you owe? The debt you already carry is inherited, passed down from your father, who inherited it from his father. It's impossible to imagine ever clearing it. The interest alone consumes more than you can spare. The moneylender is not cruel exactly, but he is patient and methodical, and he knows that time is on his side. Each year you fall slightly further behind, and each year the grip tightens just a fraction more. After the midday meal, you return to the loom. The heat of afternoon makes the work even more uncomfortable, sweat dripping into your eyes, your cotton clothes clinging to your skin. There is no relief from it, no escape. You simply endure as you endure everything else, because endurance is the only skill that matters in this life. Sometimes, as you weave, you think about the cloth's final destination. You've heard that some of it goes to towns and cities, sold in markets to people you'll never meet. You've heard that some goes even further, shipped to England, that distant place the foreign traders come from. It's strange to think of your work, these threads you've struggled with, these patterns you've created in the dim light of your hut, existing in a world so different from yours that you cannot even imagine it. But these thoughts are brief and infrequent. Mostly you focus on the immediate task, the next line, the next pattern, the inches slowly accumulating on the loom. And this is not work that allows for much reflection or imagination. It demands only attention and repetition, the steady accumulation of small actions that add up, eventually, to something that can be sold. As afternoon fades toward evening, you begin to prepare for the next day's work. This means checking on the cotton that needs to be spun into thread, a task that never ends because the loom constantly consumes thread faster than you can produce it. You sit with the spindle, feeling the cotton fibers twist together under your fingers, drawing out into thread through a motion so practiced it requires no thought. Your children help with some of these tasks, the older ones already learning the skills they'll need for their own adult lives. You watch them work and feel a complex mixture of emotions, pride in their competence, sorrow that their future looks so much like your present. You'd hoped, vaguely, that things might improve, that the next generation might have opportunities you lacked. But as the years pass, that hope has faded into something more like resigned acceptance. Evening brings a brief respite. You sit outside your hut with other women from the village, the day's work finally behind you, the night's sleep not yet upon you. These moments are rare and precious, a few minutes when the demands of survival relax their grip just slightly. You talk, though not about anything important. Small observations about the weather, minor village gossip, safe topics that don't touch on the deeper anxieties you all share. Someone mentions that soldiers pass through a village to the north, deserters from some conflict or other, taking food and valuables. Everyone grows quiet because this is not safe gossip. This is real danger. Bands of deserters, dacoits, and displaced soldiers have become increasingly common, a symptom of the larger disorder spreading across the region. When authority fragments, violence fills the gaps. The roads between villages are no longer safe, especially after dark. Traveling merchants now move in groups, sometimes hiring guards, though the guards themselves are only slightly more trustworthy than the bandits. You haven't left your village in over a year, and you have no plans to do so unless absolutely necessary. The world beyond has become a threatening unknown. As darkness settles fully, you return inside and prepare for sleep. The evening meal is small, usually just leftovers from midday, and perhaps some milk if the goat has produced any. Your children eat quickly and settle onto their mats, exhausted from their own day's work. You lie down beside them, feeling the familiar aches in your back and shoulders, the tiredness that is both physical and deeper, something spiritual or emotional that rest never quite addresses. Before sleep comes, you think about tomorrow, which will be exactly like today, which was exactly like yesterday. There is no progression, no advancement, only the endless repetition of the same struggles. The seasons change, the years pass, but your life remains fixed in place like a wheel turning in a rut it cannot escape. You think sometimes about the empire that supposedly governs you. The Mughal Empire that once, in your grandfather's stories, was a source of order and magnificence. Akbar, Shah Jahan, these names from the past, when emperors built great monuments and administered justice across vast territories. But that empire, if it ever truly existed in the form of the stories, is gone now. What remains is a hollow shell, a name invoked by tax collectors who cannot agree among themselves who has the right to collect. The emperor still sits in Delhi, you've heard, but he controls almost nothing beyond the city walls. The provinces have broken away, ruled by nawabs and subadars who acknowledge the emperor in name while ignoring him in practice. And even these regional powers are now challenged by this company, this strange entity that seems to be neither government nor merchant, but something in between. You've seen company men occasionally, usually at a distance, passing through on their way to somewhere more important than your village. They dress strangely in heavy clothes unsuited to the climate, and they move with a kind of methodical purposefulness that marks them as different from the local nobles and officials. They don't swagger or shout, they simply proceed, as if they have somewhere to be and a schedule to keep. More noticeable than the men themselves are the changes they bring. New taxes collected in new ways, with written receipts and account books, new monopolies granted and enforced, on salt, on opium, on cloth, new courts where disputes are settled according to laws you've never heard of, in a language you cannot speak. The changes accumulate slowly, almost imperceptibly, but their effect is real. The world is being remade around you, and you have no voice in the process. Sometimes you wonder if anyone notices these changes at the higher levels, if the nawabs and zamindars see what you see, feel the same sense of the ground shifting, or perhaps they're too insulated by their wealth and status to notice, too caught up in their own struggles for position. The great rarely notice what the small experience until it's too late. The night sounds filter through the thatch, crickets, distant dogs, the occasional call of a night bird. These sounds are the same as they've always been, a reassuring continuity in a world where too much else is changing. You close your eyes and try to quiet your mind, to stop the endless shunhuan of worry and calculation that accomplishes nothing but keeps you awake. Sleep comes gradually, fitfully. You drift in and out, never quite reaching the deep rest your body needs. Even in sleep, the worries continue, transforming into anxious dreams about harvest failures, about creditors, about uniformed men demanding taxes you cannot pay. You wake several times during the night, disoriented for a moment before remembering where you are and why. This is the rhythm of your days, repeating endlessly. Each sunrise brings the same tasks, the same struggles, the same small defeats and tiny victories. You are living through history, though you don't know it, living through the transition between empires, the quiet revolution that will reshape your entire world. But from where you stand, it's not history. It's just life, difficult and uncertain, to be endured one day at a time. The empire you were born under is dying, but empires die slowly over decades and generations. The new order taking its place is rising just as gradually, building itself bureaucracy by bureaucracy, contract by contract, ledger entry by ledger entry. And you, caught between these vast historical forces, simply try to survive, to feed your family, to make it through another day and then another and then another, hoping that somehow, despite everything, tomorrow might be just slightly easier than today. But tomorrow won't be easier. Tomorrow will be the same, or perhaps imperceptibly harder, as the weight of these vast transitions bears down on ordinary lives that never asked to be caught in their machinery. You'll wake again before dawn, grind again the grain, weave again the cloth, carry again the water, worry again about the taxes and the debt and the future you cannot control. And the day after that will be the same, and the day after that, in an endless procession of difficult days that blur together into a difficult life. This is what it meant to be ordinary during the slow collapse of the Mughal world, to live in confusion and anxiety, to work endlessly for rewards that never come, to watch the old order fade without understanding what would replace it, to be a small figure in a large historical drama that cared nothing for your comfort or survival. The emperor's name still appeared on coins, but those coins were worth less each year. The nawabs still held their courts, but their authority grew more theoretical with each passing season, and the company, patient and methodical, continued its slow accumulation of power, remaking India through the simple expedient of making itself indispensable. You are part of that story, though you'll never know it. Your struggles, your endurance, your quiet suffering, these are the foundation on which empire rests, the reality that grand historical narratives usually ignore. While nobles plot and merchants negotiate and administrators shuffle papers, you simply live, and your living is the hardest work of all. Let us now turn our attention to a single life, played out on a larger stage but no less trapped by circumstances beyond its control. The man we will follow for a while is Mir Jafar, whose name has come down through history, carrying judgment and scorn, but whose actual life was perhaps more pitiable than villainous, more caught than calculating. Born Mir Jafar Ali Khan around 1691, in the final years of Aurangzeb's reign, he entered a world that still seemed solid, where the Mughal Empire appeared eternal and unshakable. His family was part of the military aristocracy, not the highest ranks, but respectable, connected, able to provide him with the education and opportunities appropriate to his station. He learned Persian, the language of administration and culture, spending hours with tutors who guided him through the classical texts that every educated nobleman was expected to master. He studied the arts of war, the protocols of court, the complex web of relationships and obligations that held the empire together. The Persian he learned was not merely a language, but a key to an entire civilization, a way of thinking about power, beauty, obligation, and honor. The poetry he memorized, verses from Hafiz and Sa'di, lines from the great epics, provided not just aesthetic pleasure, but moral instruction, models of behavior, ways of understanding the world. The military training he received taught him horsemanship and swordsmanship, the management of troops, the logistics of campaigns, but more importantly, it taught him the hierarchy of command, the importance of loyalty, the bonds between officers and men that made an army function. In his youth, the empire still functioned more or less as it was meant to. Governors reported to Delhi, taxes flowed upward, justice was administered according to established procedures. There were problems, certainly. Aurangzeb's expensive campaigns in the Deccan were draining the treasury. Rebellions flared in various provinces. The court was full of factions competing for influence. But these seemed like the normal troubles of any large state, manageable, temporary. The young Mir Jafar would have heard discussions of these troubles in his family's household, would have listened as older relatives debated the wisdom of the emperor's policies, the prospects for this or that noble family, the opportunities that might arise from the empire's difficulties. These were the conversations that shaped his understanding of how power worked, how one advanced, how one survived. Mir Jafar rose through the ranks slowly, as was appropriate. He served in various military capacities, building a reputation as competent if not brilliant, reliable if not inspired. This was the path of the minor nobility, not to stand out too much, not to attract too much attention, but to be there, to be useful, to accumulate small advantages that might, over decades, amount to something significant. Each posting taught him something new. Each commander he served under provided a model of leadership or a cautionary tale of failure. He learned which battles to fight and which to avoid, which alliances to cultivate and which to decline politely. He learned how to manage his subordinates with enough firmness to command respect, but enough flexibility to retain their loyalty. He learned the delicate art of court politics, how to pay compliments that seemed sincere, how to navigate between powerful rivals without committing too fully to either side. These were skills that took years to develop, subtle calibrations of word and gesture that could mean the difference between advancement and stagnation. He married, had children, maintained a household that reflected his status. The household was not lavish, he could not afford lavish, but it was comfortable, refined, attentive to the proprieties. There were servants, though not too many, each with their assigned duties, their place in the household hierarchy. There were rituals of hospitality, the offering of pan and rosewater to guests, the careful observation of rank and precedence. There were evening gatherings where poetry might be recited, where the news from court might be discussed in carefully neutral terms. His wife managed the women's quarters, raised the children according to the customs of their class, maintained the social connections that were as important as his military ones. The children grew up learning the same lessons he had learned, preparing for lives similar to his own. His sons would enter military or administrative service, his daughters would marry into families of similar standing, and the cycle would continue. By the 1730s, Mir Jafar had aligned himself with Bengal, that wealthy eastern province that was becoming increasingly autonomous from Delhi. Bengal's wealth came from its agriculture, rice, jute, sugar, and from its textiles, the fine muslins and cottons that were sought after across the world. The province's capital, Murshidabad, was growing into a major city rivaling Delhi itself in certain respects. Its bazaars were filled with goods from across India and beyond. Its mosques and temples testified to the region's prosperity. Its palaces housed a court that was becoming increasingly magnificent. Serving in Bengal meant serving under the nawabs, who increasingly ran the province as their own domain, paying lip service to Mughal authority but acting independently in most matters. Mir Jafar became part of the military establishment of these nawabs, a senior officer, a man of some importance in the provincial hierarchy. It was a good position, offering status and income, requiring political skill to navigate the factions at court, but not impossibly difficult for a man of experience. The nawabs he served under were, for the most part, capable administrators who understood that their power rested on maintaining Bengal's prosperity and keeping the various factions at court in balance. He was getting older now, into his 50s, at an age when men begin to think about consolidation rather than advancement. He wanted security for his family, confirmation of his rank, the assurance that the position he'd built over decades would not suddenly evaporate. This was not unreasonable. It was what any man in his position would want. He had served faithfully, had performed his duties competently, had navigated the complexities of court life without making fatal enemies. He should have been able to look forward to a dignified old age, to seeing his children established, to enjoying the respect due to a man of his years and experience. But the world was changing in ways that made such stability impossible. The East India Company, which had been a presence in Bengal for decades as a trading concern, was becoming something else, something larger and more ambitious. The company had started as merchants, buying textiles and spices and other Indian goods to sell in Europe. But it had gradually accumulated other functions, military forces to protect its warehouses, agreements with local rulers for trading privileges, the right to collect certain taxes in return for loans. These changes happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, each small expansion of authority seeming reasonable in itself. The military forces were initially just guards for the warehouses, protection against bandits and rival traders. But those guards became soldiers, and those soldiers became regiments, and those regiments began to look like an army. The trading privileges were initially just exemptions from certain local taxes, advantages that made it easier to conduct business. But those privileges expanded, became more extensive, created a parallel structure of authority that existed alongside but separate from the nawab's administration. By the 1750s, the company was no longer just a commercial organization. It had its own army, mostly Indian soldiers commanded by European officers. It had fortifications at Calcutta and other coastal locations, substantial defensive works that suggested not a trading post, but a military installation. It was involved in the political machinations of the region, lending money to nobles, making agreements, interfering in succession disputes. It was becoming a power in its own right, though still nominally subordinate to whichever nawab happened to be ruling Bengal. The company officials lived in considerable style, their houses in Calcutta increasingly grand, their entertainments increasingly elaborate. They formed a community apart, neither fully Indian nor fully European, operating according to rules that blended commercial calculation with political ambition. They were making fortunes, individually and collectively, and those fortunes gave them influence that extended far beyond what their official positions would suggest. The nawab during this crucial period was Siraj ud-Daulah, a young man who ascended to power in 1756 at the age of about 23. Siraj was impetuous, proud, acutely aware that the company was encroaching on his authority. He saw the fortifications the company was building at Calcutta, saw the way company officials dealt with him as if he were merely one player among many rather than the rightful ruler, and he resented it deeply. His resentment was not irrational. The company was indeed undermining his authority, was indeed treating him as less than a sovereign ruler. But his youth and temperament made him respond to these provocations in ways that were sometimes counterproductive, sometimes simply rash. He would issue demands that the company would ignore, would threaten consequences he lacked the power to enforce. Mir Jafar, now in his 60s, was one of Siraj's senior commanders, a man who had served under previous nawabs and was expected to continue serving loyally. But Mir Jafar found the young nawab difficult, mercurial, quick to anger, suspicious of the older nobles who had served his predecessors. There was tension, the kind that makes a courtier's life uncomfortable, that makes one wonder if one's position is as secure as it should be. Siraj would sometimes question Mir Jafar's advice, would overrule his recommendations, would suggest, not explicitly, but through gesture and tone, that perhaps the older man's loyalty was not as complete as it should be. This was deeply unsettling for Mir Jafar, who had spent his entire career building a reputation for reliability, who had always been the man one could count on to follow orders and support his superiors. To have that questioned, to sense that his position was becoming precarious, was profoundly disturbing. In 1756, Siraj acted on his frustrations with the company. He marched on Calcutta with his forces, captured the company's fortifications, drove the British out temporarily. It was a bold move, an assertion of authority, a statement that Bengal belonged to its nawab and not to foreign merchants. For a brief moment it seemed that Siraj had successfully checked the company's ambitions, had reminded everyone that however wealthy and well-armed the company might be, it was still subject to the nawab's authority. The capture of Calcutta was accomplished relatively easily, the company's defences proving inadequate against a determined assault by the nawab's forces. The British fled downriver, seeking refuge in their other settlements, leaving behind warehouses full of goods and fortifications that Siraj occupied. But the company did not accept defeat. It sent forces back to Bengal, commanded by Robert Clive and supported by company troops and artillery. What followed was a complex period of negotiation, threat, and manoeuvring, months during which it was unclear whether there would be another battle or whether some accommodation could be reached. The company wanted not just to return to Calcutta, but to ensure that its position in Bengal was unassailable, that no future nawab could threaten it again. Clive, a former clerk who had transformed himself into a military commander, understood that military force alone might not be sufficient. The nawab's army was larger than anything the company could field, and a direct confrontation might end in company defeat. What was needed was a way to divide Siraj's forces, to ensure that when battle came, the odds would be more favourable. And this is where Mir Jafar's tragedy begins to unfold. The company, looking for ways to secure its position, began making contact with nobles in Siraj's court, who might be persuaded to support the company's interests. Mir Jafar was one of those nobles. The company's representatives, particularly one merchant named William Watts and later Robert Clive himself, approached him with a proposal. These approaches were cautious at first, exploratory, testing whether Mir Jafar might be receptive to such an arrangement. The conversations happened in private, away from court, in settings where there would be no witnesses to what was being discussed. Watts and Clive were skilled at these negotiations, knowing exactly how to present their offer in terms that would be most appealing, most difficult to refuse. The proposal was essentially a conspiracy. If Mir Jafar would agree not to support Siraj in the event of a battle between the Nawab and the company would ensure that Mir Jafar became the next Nawab of Bengal. He would be placed on the throne, would receive all the honors and titles appropriate to that position, would rule Bengal as its Nawab, with the company's support, and implicitly under the company's influence. It was an extraordinarily tempting offer for a man in Mir Jafar's position. He was already in his 60s, his position under Siraj was uncertain, and here was an opportunity to achieve the highest rank in the province, to become what his father and grandfather had never been, to elevate his family to a level they had never reached. But it was also an enormously risky and morally compromising proposition. It meant betraying his Nawab, betraying the trust of the position he held, allying himself with foreigners against his own court. Everything he had been taught about loyalty, about honor, about proper conduct, pointed toward refusing. We will never know exactly what went through Mir Jafar's mind as he considered this offer. Did he justify it by telling himself that Siraj was a poor ruler, that Bengal would be better off under someone else? Did he convince himself that the company was too powerful to resist, that the only choice was whether to be on the winning side or the losing side? Did he simply want the throne so badly that moral considerations faded in the face of ambition? Perhaps he thought about his family, about providing them with security and status that would last beyond his own life. Perhaps he told himself that this was simply pragmatism, recognizing the reality of power and acting accordingly. Perhaps he believed that as Nawab he would have sufficient authority to protect Bengal's interests, that he could manage the company, keep them from completely dominating the province. Perhaps he deceived himself about what this arrangement would actually mean. What we know is that he agreed. He signed a treaty with the company, a document that laid out the terms of their arrangement. In return for his support, or rather, his lack of support for Siraj, he would become Nawab. The treaty specified various other terms, payments the new Nawab would make to the company, trading privileges to be granted, territories to be ceded. It was, in effect, a contract to sell the independence of Bengal to the company in return for a throne. The document was written in English, a language Mir Jafar could not read, though it was explained to him through interpreters. He affixed his seal to it, that physical act of pressing his personal seal into wax, making the agreement official. In that moment, whatever doubts he had were suppressed, whatever moral qualms he felt were pushed aside. The confrontation came at Plassey in June 1757. It was not in truth much of a battle. Siraj's forces greatly outnumbered the company's, but a significant portion of those forces, commanded by Mir Jafar and others who had made similar arrangements with the company, simply did not fight. They held back, watching, waiting to see how events would unfold. The company's artillery, superior to anything Siraj had, did its work. The portion of Siraj's army that remained loyal fought bravely, but was overwhelmed. The battle was decided in a few hours, most of which consisted of artillery bombardment, and the slow realization among Siraj's loyal troops that they had been abandoned by much of their own army. Siraj fled, was captured shortly after, and was executed by Mir Jafar's men. The young Nawab who had tried to assert his authority against the company was dead, killed on the orders of the man who had been his senior commander. Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, ascending to a throne made vacant by betrayal and execution. It should have been Mir Jafar's moment of triumph, the culmination of his career, the achievement of the highest honor available to him. Instead, it was the beginning of a prolonged nightmare, a demonstration that a throne gained through betrayal rests on foundations that can never be secure. The first problem was money. The company had not elevated Mir Jafar out of generosity. They expected to be paid, and paid handsomely. The treaty specified enormous sums to be given to the company and its officials, compensation for their losses at Calcutta, rewards for their military support, payments to individual company officers. The amounts were staggering, far beyond what Bengal's treasury actually contained, totaling millions of rupees. Mir Jafar tried to meet these demands, emptying the treasury, confiscating wealth from nobles who had supported Siraj, imposing new taxes, liquidating assets. But there simply wasn't enough money. The company officials grew impatient, then angry. They had expected to become rich from this arrangement, had anticipated fortunes that would allow them to return to England as wealthy men, and they were not interested in excuses about fiscal reality. They pressured Mir Jafar constantly, demanding payments he couldn't make, threatening to withdraw their support if he didn't comply. Clive himself became increasingly harsh in his demands, treating Mir Jafar with barely disguised contempt when the promised payments failed to materialize. At the same time, Mir Jafar had to maintain the appearance of authority, had to run the province, had to reward his own supporters, and maintain his own household in a style befitting a nawab. But he had no real independence. Every major decision required company approval. Every significant appointment had to be cleared with company officials. His authority extended only as far as the company permitted. He was a puppet, and increasingly everyone knew it. The pretense of his being an independent ruler became harder and harder to maintain as company officials openly countermanded his orders, as company troops moved through the province without his authorization, as company administrators began collecting revenues directly. The nobles and officials who had not been part of the conspiracy looked at Mir Jafar with contempt. He had betrayed his nawab, had allied with foreigners, had sold the province's independence for personal advancement. His legitimacy was fundamentally compromised, his authority hollow. When he gave orders, they were obeyed slowly, reluctantly, or not at all. His court became a place of tension and barely concealed disrespect, where the normal protocols of deference to the nawab were performed mechanically, without any genuine respect. Officials would arrive late to meetings, would question his decisions openly, would appeal to the company over his head. And he was afraid, constantly. He had betrayed one nawab. Might he not be betrayed in turn? The company had shown they were willing to replace rulers who didn't serve their interests, had demonstrated that throne and title meant nothing if company support was withdrawn. If Mir Jafar couldn't meet their financial demands, if he proved difficult or unreliable, they could simply depose him and install someone else. He had no security, no guarantee that the throne he'd schemed to obtain wouldn't be taken away at any moment. Every message from company officials made him anxious. Every meeting might be the one where they told him his services were no longer needed. His nights were long. He would sit in his palace at Murshidabad, in rooms that had once housed nawabs of real power, and feel the weight of his choices. The rooms were beautiful, marble floors, intricate decorations, windows overlooking the river where boats moved in the moonlight. But they felt like a prison. He could not leave without company permission, could not travel to other parts of Bengal without company escort. He could not make policy without company approval, could not appoint officials without company consent. He was Nawab in name only, a ceremonial figure whose actual power was negligible. At night, unable to sleep, he would review his decisions, would wonder if there had been another path, would imagine what might have happened if he had remained loyal to Siraj. The company officials who dealt with him were often younger men, military officers, and merchants who had come to India to make their fortunes. They treated him with a kind of perfunctory respect that barely masked their contempt. They would arrive at his court, ignore the elaborate protocols of courtesy that had once governed such interactions, and simply state their demands. They spoke to him as a subordinate, not as a ruler, their tone making clear that they viewed him as their employee rather than as Bengal's nawab. Some of them were barely 30 years old, young men who would never have dared speak to a Mughal noble in such tones a generation earlier. But times had changed, and they knew where power lay. Mir Jafar tried in small ways to assert some independence. He corresponded with other Indian rulers, seeking alliances that might provide leverage against the company. He tried to play company officials off against each other, exploiting their own internal rivalries and ambitions, hoping to find one faction that might support his attempts at greater autonomy. He looked for any crack, any opportunity to maneuver himself into a position of greater autonomy. He sent letters to Delhi appealing to Mughal authority, even though he knew that authority was largely symbolic. He made overtures to the French, who still had settlements in India and might serve as a counterweight to British power. But every such attempt failed. The company had intelligence networks, informants at his court, ways of knowing what he was planning before he could execute any plan. When they discovered his attempts at independent action, they would confront him, remind him of his dependence, threaten consequences. They would produce copies of his letters, would recite conversations he thought were private, making it clear that nothing he did was hidden from them. He would retreat, apologize, assure them of his loyalty, promise that there had been some misunderstanding. It was humiliating, and it happened repeatedly, each incident eroding further what little dignity he had managed to preserve. In 1760, the company decided Mir Jafar was more trouble than he was worth. They deposed him and installed his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, as the new nawab. Mir Jafar was pushed aside, given a pension, told to retire quietly. The deposition was handled bureaucratically, with company officials informing him that the arrangement was no longer working, that they had decided on a change. For 3 years he lived in this limbo, no longer nawab, but unable to return to what he'd been before. He watched as Mir Qasim tried to assert more independence than the company would tolerate, watched as that too failed. Mir Qasim was younger, more energetic, more willing to challenge company authority directly. He tried to reform the administration, tried to build up military forces that might resist company demands, tried to create alliances with other Indian rulers. For a while it seemed he might succeed where Mir Jafar had failed. But the company's response was decisive and brutal, leading to a war that Mir Qasim ultimately lost. In 1763, the company decided to restore Mir Jafar to the throne. Mir Qasim had proven too ambitious, too willing to challenge company authority. They needed someone more compliant, more controllable, someone who had already been broken and would make no trouble. Mir Jafar, weakened by age and broken by experience, was brought back. He resumed the position he'd betrayed his way into, now more powerless than ever, now understanding with complete clarity what his position actually meant. This time there was no illusion, no possibility of believing he had any real authority. He died in 1765, having served as nawab in 2 separate periods, for a total of about 8 years. He was in his 70s, exhausted, having lived to see the complete evisceration of the position he'd so desperately wanted. In those final years, the company had moved beyond even the pretense of respecting his authority. They collected taxes directly, administered justice, made policy, governed Bengal in all but name. He was simply there, a figurehead, an actor, in a play that had already ended. His final illness was prolonged, his body failing gradually, giving him time to reflect on what his life had amounted to. History has not been kind to Mir Jafar. His name has become synonymous with betrayal, with selling out one's country to foreigners. In later years, during India's independence movement, he would be invoked as the ultimate example of treachery, the man who opened the door through which the British walked to conquer India. Children would learn his name as a cautionary tale, the villain of the story, the man whose ambition destroyed his country. But from inside his experience, from the perspective of a man living through those years, the moral calculations were perhaps less clear than they appear in hindsight. He lived in a time when loyalties were complex and shifting, when the old certainties of Mughal authority had already dissolved, when every noble was trying to navigate between competing powers and uncertain futures. Let us drift now into a different kind of loss, one quieter and less dramatic than military defeat or political collapse, but profound in its own way. We turn our attention to the libraries of the Mughal world, to the thousands upon thousands of manuscripts that once circulated through the empire, and to the slow, silent disappearance of much of that textual heritage. Imagine, for a moment, the Mughal Empire at its height in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The empire is wealthy, its rulers are patrons of learning and the arts, and there is a flourishing culture of book production. In the royal library at Agra or Delhi, scribes work in quiet rooms, copying texts in elegant calligraphy, creating manuscripts that are not just books but works of art. The sound in these rooms is distinctive, the scratch of reed pens on paper, the occasional rustle as a completed page is set aside to dry, the soft breathing of men engaged in work requiring total concentration. These manuscripts cover every conceivable subject. There are religious texts, copies of the Quran in breathtaking calligraphy, commentaries on Islamic law, Sufi mystical poetry. There are histories, detailed chronicles of the Mughal emperors and their predecessors, accounts of battles and court intrigues, biographies of important figures. These historical works were not neutral records, but carefully crafted narratives, often commissioned by rulers to shape how their reigns would be remembered. There are literary works, poetry in Persian, the court language, tales and romances, philosophical treatises. The ghazal form flourished in Mughal courts, poets crafting verses of extraordinary sophistication about love, wine, mystical union with the divine. There are also practical texts, treatises on medicine, drawing on both Islamic medical traditions and Indian Ayurvedic knowledge, works on astronomy and astrology, manuals of administration explaining how to assess land revenue or organize military campaigns, agricultural texts describing crop cycles and irrigation techniques. These practical manuscripts reveal a civilization deeply engaged with the material world, seeking to understand and systematize knowledge that could be applied to governance and daily life. Each manuscript is created by hand. A scribe sits with paper, reed pen, and ink, copying text from another manuscript or sometimes taking dictation from an author. The work is slow, requiring intense concentration. A single mistake means starting the page over or attempting a correction that may or may not be invisible. A substantial manuscript might take weeks or months to complete. The scribe's posture is critical to his work. Seated cross-legged, the manuscript board resting on his lap or on a low stand, his body positioned so light falls correctly on the page. Hours spent in this position day after day leave their mark. Back problems are common among scribes, as is weakening eyesight from years of close work in lamplight. For particularly important or prestigious works, illuminators add decoration. The margins might be filled with intricate floral patterns in gold leaf. Chapter headings might be written in colored inks, deep blues made from lapis lazuli, brilliant reds from cinnabar, greens from malachite. Some manuscripts include miniature paintings illustrating key scenes, the tiny figures painted with extraordinary detail, their faces given individual expressions, their clothes adorned with patterns too small to see without peering closely. The illuminator's tools are as specialized as the scribe's: fine brushes made from squirrel hair, or even single strands for the most delicate work, palettes, mixing pigments, burnishing tools to polish gold leaf until it gleams. The process of creating a single illuminated page might take days, the artist working in stages as different layers of paint dry, building up colors gradually to achieve the desired richness and depth. This work happens in many locations across the empire. The royal library at the capital is the most prestigious, but nobles maintain their own libraries. Wealthy merchants commission manuscripts. Religious institutions have collections of texts related to their traditions. In major cities like Lahore, Agra, Delhi, Lucknow, there are workshops where professional scribes and artists work, creating manuscripts on commission. These workshops often cluster in particular neighborhoods, creating communities of craftspeople who share techniques, compete for commissions, and train the next generation. The paper itself is significant, much of it locally made from cotton or hemp, the sheets sized with starch to create a smooth surface for writing. Some premium manuscripts use paper imported from Central Asia or even China, prized for its particular texture or color. The binding of important manuscripts is a craft unto itself, boards covered with leather, sometimes embossed or stamped with geometric patterns, sometimes inlaid with other materials. The binding must protect the pages while allowing the book to open fully, a technical challenge requiring skill and experience. The economic system supporting this work is patronage. A wealthy individual, the emperor, a noble, a successful merchant, provides financial support to scholars, poets, scribes, artists. In return, they receive dedicated works, often with elaborate introductions, praising the patron's generosity and wisdom. This system works well when the empire is wealthy and stable, when patrons have secure incomes from land or trade, and can afford to spend lavishly on cultural production. The relationship between patron and artist is complex, involving both genuine appreciation and social obligation. A successful poet might move between patrons, dedicating works to different nobles in hopes of securing the most generous support. A scribe might work for years for the same patron, becoming in some sense part of the household, his welfare tied to his patron's fortunes. This personal dimension meant that cultural production was embedded in social relationships, not an abstract market transaction, but as the empire weakens in the 18th century, patronage begins to dry up. The provinces become increasingly independent, and provincial rulers are focused on military survival rather than cultural patronage. The nobles who once maintained libraries find their estates squeezed by competing tax demands, their incomes diminishing. The old mechanisms of cultural support begin to break down. A noble who once might have commissioned multiple manuscripts each year, who supported resident scholars and poets, finds he can barely maintain his armed retainers. The library becomes a luxury he cannot afford. The scholars and artists find themselves without support. This transition doesn't happen overnight, but gradually, as declining revenues make patronage increasingly difficult. A patron might still commission occasional works, but can no longer maintain the steady support that allowed artists to focus entirely on their craft. What happens to libraries when their patrons disappear? Some manuscripts are sold page by page to whoever will buy them. The material value of the book, the paper, the binding is negligible, but collectors and other libraries might pay small amounts for interesting texts. A family library accumulated over generations might be dispersed in a few years, the manuscript scattered to different buyers, the collection as a coherent whole destroyed. The process of dispersal is painful to imagine. Heirs to a noble house, impoverished and desperate, watching as their grandfather's carefully assembled collection is sold piece by piece. They might try to hold on to a few volumes, the most precious, or most personally meaningful, but economic necessity forces most to be sold. The buyers at these sales are a mixed group, other nobles trying to maintain their own collections, merchants who see manuscripts as portable wealth, European officials beginning to take interest in Oriental texts. Each purchase breaks another connection in the web of cultural continuity. He made choices that seemed, at the moment, to offer security and advancement, choices that many others in similar positions were also making. Those choices destroyed him, but perhaps any choice available to him would have led to some version of destruction. What makes Mir Jafar's story worth dwelling on is not that he was uniquely wicked or uniquely foolish, but that he was ordinary, a man of moderate ambition and moderate ability, caught in circumstances that demanded extraordinary judgment. He was asked to navigate a historical transition that no one fully understood at the time, to choose between powers whose trajectories were still unclear, to bet his life and honor on outcomes he could not predict. He bet wrong. Or perhaps there was no right bet. Perhaps any choice available to him would have led to some version of ruin. The company was going to dominate Bengal regardless of whether Mir Jafar helped them or not. They had the resources, the organization, the ruthlessness necessary for that domination. By helping them, he secured a brief period of prominence and a longer period of powerless anxiety. By opposing them, he likely would have died in battle or shortly after, like Siraj, his name remembered with honor, but his family left vulnerable and destitute. The real tragedy is that there may have been no path that led to a good outcome, no choice that would have preserved both his honor and his life. The real tragedy of Mir Jafar's life is not his betrayal, but his irrelevance. He thought he was making a choice that mattered, that would shape his destiny and his family's future. In reality, he was a small piece in a much larger game, moved around by forces that barely noticed his existence. The company would have conquered Bengal with him, or without him, would have found another noble to work with, another way to divide Siraj's forces. He simply happened to be the instrument they used, and his reward was to live long enough to understand how completely he'd been used. The throne he gained was never real. The power he thought he'd secured was always illusory, and his role was always to be a tool in someone else's hands. When he died in 1765, the transition he'd helped facilitate was nearly complete. The company was the real power in Bengal, collecting revenues of millions of rupees annually, administering a population of many millions. The Mughal emperor in Delhi, still nominally the sovereign of all India, had just granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, the formal right to collect taxes and administer the province. The fiction of Indian rule was being replaced by the reality of company administration, the transformation becoming official and undeniable. Mir Jafar's son and grandson would continue to hold the title of nawab, but it was purely ceremonial, a position maintained because it was useful for the company to have a local figurehead. They lived in palaces, received pensions, performed rituals of state, but everyone knew they were actors in a performance whose script was written by the company, whose every move was choreographed by British officials. They would attend ceremonies, would give formal approval to decisions already made, would exist as symbols of a continuity that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The pattern established at Plassey would repeat across India over the following decades. The company would find disaffected nobles, would offer them support against their rivals, would use those alliances to insert itself into local power structures. Once inserted, it would consolidate, would gradually transfer real authority from the nominal ruler to company officials, would transform allies into dependents and dependents into figureheads. This was the method that would be used in Mysore, in Hyderabad, in the territories of the Marathas, in principality after principality across the subcontinent. It was conquest, but conquest of a new type, not armies sweeping across territory in dramatic campaigns, but a slow, bureaucratic infiltration, power accruing through contracts and treaties and financial arrangements. Where traditional conquest was visible and dramatic, this was quiet and almost invisible, the kind of thing that people living through it might not fully recognize as conquest until it was complete. Territory changed hands not through surrender after battle, but through treaties signed in counting houses, authority transferred not through military occupation, but through the accumulation of administrative functions. And that perhaps is what we should understand from Mir Jafar's life, that great historical changes often work through ordinary people making what seem like reasonable choices, that the individuals who facilitate those changes are not necessarily monsters, but simply people trying to survive and advance in confusing times, and that the real power lies not with those individuals, but with the larger structures and systems that use them as instruments. Mir Jafar thought he was securing a throne, thought he was making a decision that would benefit him and his family. He was actually participating in the end of an era, the moment when one form of empire gave way to another, when the old patterns of Indian politics were being replaced by something fundamentally different. He did not understand this. He could not have understood it because the pattern was only becoming clear as it unfolded, because no one at the time could see the full arc of what was happening. He saw only his immediate circumstances, his immediate choices, the pressure he was under from Siraj, and the opportunity being offered by the company. History sees the larger pattern and judges him for not seeing what was only visible in retrospect. But perhaps we should offer him, if not forgiveness, then at least a kind of weary compassion. He was trapped by forces he could not control, making choices between bad options and worse options, trying to secure safety in a world where safety was no longer available. He failed, as most people in his position would have failed, as perhaps anyone would have failed when caught in such circumstances, and his failure became a chapter in a larger story of conquest and transformation that would reshape the entire subcontinent, that would end an empire that had lasted centuries and replace it with a different kind of empire entirely. His name became a symbol, but the man himself was simply a person caught in forces beyond his comprehension, doing what he thought necessary, and discovering too late that he had destroyed not just his honor, but any possibility of the security he had sought. Some manuscripts simply decay. Paper in the Indian climate, especially during the humid monsoon season, is vulnerable to mold, insects, water damage. A manuscript stored carefully in a dry room with regular airing might survive for centuries. A manuscript left in a damp storage room, forgotten, will deteriorate quickly. The pages stick together, the ink runs, mold grows across the text, making it illegible. Within a generation, the manuscript is ruined. The physical processes of decay are relentless. Silverfish eat the starch in paper, leaving holes that obliterate text. Humidity causes the sizing to break down, the paper becoming limp and weak. Insects nest in bindings, their larvae consuming leather and thread. Without constant vigilance and care, without the resources to maintain proper storage conditions, manuscripts succumb to natural processes. Some manuscripts are deliberately destroyed or repurposed. Paper is valuable and old manuscripts might be unbound, and their blank spaces used for new writing, or the paper itself pulped and remade. This is not vandalism exactly, it's practical recycling by people who need paper and for whom the text on an old manuscript has no value. A medieval history or a philosophical treatise means nothing to someone who needs paper to wrap goods for sale or to keep accounts. There are documented cases of important manuscripts being found wrapped around parcels in bazaars, the text considered worthless by the merchant who repurposed it. Blank end papers are covered with shopping lists, accounts, children's practice writing. Margins become spaces for completely unrelated notes. The original text becomes a palimpsest, overlaid with later uses that have nothing to do with its original purpose. Some manuscripts leave India entirely. European traders, officials, scholars develop an interest in Oriental texts during the 18th century. They purchase manuscripts, sometimes paying fair prices, sometimes acquiring them in dubious circumstances. These texts are shipped back to Europe, ending up in libraries in London, Paris, Oxford, wherever the buyer happens to be from. They survive, but they are removed from the cultural context that produced them, become objects of European scholarship rather than part of a living Indian textual tradition. The manuscript that once circulated among Persian-reading scholars in Delhi ends up in a glass case in the British Library, examined by Orientalists who read the language but don't inhabit the culture that produced the text. This removal has complex consequences. The manuscripts are preserved but also appropriated, saved from potential destruction but divorced from their original context. The European collectors often have little understanding of what they're buying, making decisions based on partial knowledge or aesthetic appeal rather than scholarly significance. The result is a kind of hemorrhaging of cultural memory. Knowledge that was once widely available, texts that educated people could reasonably expect to find and consult, become rare or lost entirely. Later scholars trying to reconstruct the intellectual history of the period find themselves working with fragments, with references in other texts to works that no longer exist, with gaps in the record that can never be filled. The intellectual world of 17th century Mughal India, which was coherent and interconnected for people living in it, becomes for us a puzzle with many pieces missing. Some of these losses are documented, which makes them particularly poignant. A 17th century chronicler might mention that a particular noble wrote a detailed autobiography, or that a scholar produced a commentary on a classical text. Later researchers search for these works, check catalogues of surviving manuscripts in libraries around the world, and find nothing. The work is mentioned, we know it existed, but we don't have it. It's gone. The knowledge that a text once existed but is now irretrievable is in some ways more frustrating than if we had never known about it. We can see the gap in our understanding, but cannot fill it. Other losses are not even documented. We don't know what we don't know. There might have been entire genres of writing that were common in the 17th century but have left no trace because all copies disappeared. There might have been authors who were well known in their time, but whose works were not considered important enough to preserve carefully. The absence is total and silent. It's the works we don't even know to search for that represent the deepest loss, the poets whose names have been completely forgotten, the historians whose chronicles covered events now known only through other surviving sources. Consider as a specific example the question of palace libraries. The Mughal emperors maintained substantial libraries, as did the nawabs of major provinces. What happened to these collections as power shifted? Some were dispersed when palaces were looted during conflicts. Some were gradually sold off by impoverished descendants of the original owners. Some burned in fires, and fire is a constant danger for collections of paper in buildings lit by oil lamps. The vulnerability of manuscript collections to fire cannot be overstated. A single lamp knocked over, a kitchen fire spreading, and decades or centuries of accumulated texts can be destroyed in hours. There are documented cases of libraries burning, the manuscripts fueling fires that consumed entire buildings. The library at the Red Fort in Delhi, for instance, was looted at least twice, once during Nadir Shah's invasion in 1739, again during the chaos following the 1857 rebellion. How much was lost in those events? We don't know with any precision. Catalogues might have existed, but if they did, they likely were lost along with the books. We have a vague sense that there was a substantial collection, but its exact contents remain mysterious. Contemporary accounts mention soldiers carrying away armfuls of manuscripts, the books valued more for their bindings than their contents. Many probably discarded once the binding was removed. Or consider the libraries of Lucknow, the capital of Awadh, which was a major centre of learning in the 18th century. The nawabs of Awadh patronized scholars and poets, and substantial manuscript collections were built up. When the British annexed Awadh in 1856, what happened to those libraries? Some manuscripts were preserved, some were purchased by British officials and ended up in European collections, but many simply vanished into the chaos of annexation and the subsequent rebellion. The 1857 uprising created conditions particularly hostile to manuscript preservation. Buildings occupied by soldiers, libraries ransacked for anything valuable, manuscripts left vulnerable to weather and theft. In the aftermath, when survivors tried to piece their lives back together, manuscript collections were often low priority compared to securing food and shelter. There are tantalizing mentions in various sources of specific manuscripts that would be invaluable if they could be located. A detailed account of the court of Muhammad Shah, the Mughal emperor, during whose reign the empire's decline accelerated. A comprehensive Persian Sanskrit dictionary compiled by a scholar working in Benares, a collection of letters between Mughal nobles discussing the political situation in the 1740s. These works are mentioned in other texts, so we know they existed at some point. But where are they now? Do copies survive in some private collection, uncatalogued and unexamined? Or are they simply gone? The possibility that lost manuscripts might still exist somewhere, forgotten in a private library or misidentified in a collection, adds a layer of hope to the story, but also frustration. Every few years a manuscript resurfaces, something thought lost proves to have survived, and this confirms that other texts might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered. The mystery deepens when we consider works that might have existed but left no trace at all. How many people kept diaries or journals that were discarded after their deaths? How many merchants kept detailed business records that would give us insight into trade patterns and economic conditions? How many ordinary people wrote letters, poems, observations that were not considered important enough to preserve? The bias in preservation favors certain types of texts, works by famous authors, religious texts, official chronicles. Personal documents, business records, ordinary correspondence had much higher rates of loss because no one thought to preserve them systematically. We tend to think of historical knowledge as cumulative, as something that grows over time as we learn more. But in reality, knowledge is also constantly being lost. Every generation that passes without carefully preserving texts from earlier generations is a generation in which loss occurs. And the 18th century in India was a period when the mechanisms of preservation were breaking down, when the institutions that had maintained textual traditions were failing. The breakdown wasn't sudden but incremental, fewer manuscripts being produced, existing collections maintained less carefully, the knowledge of preservation techniques not being passed on effectively. Each small failure contributed to a larger pattern of loss. The scribes themselves, the skilled calligraphers who copied manuscripts, found their services less in demand. As patronage dried up, there was simply less work available. Some scribes shifted to other occupations, their skills unused. Others continued working but could only find occasional commissions, not the steady employment that had once been available. The craft began to die out, not because the skills were forgotten, but because there was no longer an economic structure supporting their use. A master calligrapher might train his son in the art only to watch him abandon it for more reliable employment. The inks used in manuscript preparation were complex mixtures, often made according to recipes passed down through families of scribes. These inks had to be durable, resistant to fading, smooth in application. Each scribe might have his own preferred formulation, slight variations in ingredients or proportions that he believed produced superior results. As the scribal profession contracted, this specialized knowledge began to be lost. Later attempts to recreate historical inks rely on guesswork and experimentation because the detailed recipes were rarely written down. They were taught directly, master to apprentice, and when that chain of transmission broke, the knowledge vanished. Modern conservation efforts struggle with this loss. How do you preserve manuscripts when you don't fully understand the materials used to create them? The loss extends to other aspects of manuscript culture. The techniques of papermaking, of preparing skins for binding, of mixing gold leaf for illumination, all these crafts depended on steady practice and transmission of knowledge. As demand for manuscripts decreased, as European printed books began to arrive and offer a cheaper alternative, these traditional crafts declined. By the 19th century, the knowledge still existed but was rare, held by a diminishing number of aging practitioners. There is something particularly melancholy about imagining the last master craftsman of a particular technique, knowing his skills but having no students to teach, watching his tradition die with him. Did such people exist in 18th century India? Almost certainly. A master illuminator who had spent decades perfecting his art, who could create miniature paintings of extraordinary beauty, finding that no one was commissioning such work anymore. A calligrapher who had devoted his life to mastering the intricacies of Nastaliq script, discovering that his services were no longer needed. These people lived through the end of their worlds, watching traditions they embodied become obsolete. Some probably tried to preserve their knowledge by writing it down, creating manuals or guides that future generations might use. But these efforts were limited. Much craft knowledge is tacit, embedded in muscle memory and intuition rather than explicit rules that can be written. The loss of practitioners meant the loss of knowledge that couldn't be fully captured in text. A manual might explain the steps for mixing ink, but it couldn't convey the feel of properly prepared ink under the pen, the subtle adjustments in technique that separate adequate work from excellent work. Museums and libraries today hold manuscript collections that give us a window into what was preserved. These manuscripts are beautiful objects. The calligraphy is elegant. The illuminations are stunning. The physical craft of bookmaking is evident in every page. But looking at them also evokes a sense of loss because we know these are survivors, the tiny fraction that made it through the centuries of decay, dispersal, and destruction. For every manuscript sitting in a climate-controlled archive today, how many similar manuscripts did not survive? If we have one copy of a particular historical chronicle, how many other copies were there originally? 10, 50, 100? And of those other copies, which might have contained marginal notes by readers, additional information inserted by later scribes, corrections of errors, all the small accretions that would make them valuable sources. Each copy of a text is unique in small ways. Different scribes make different errors, readers add different annotations, later owners might insert additional material. The loss of multiple copies means the loss of this variation and accumulation. We have one witness to a text when there might once have been dozens, each slightly different. Consider, too, the question of languages. The Mughal court primarily used Persian, and so many of the surviving manuscripts are in that language. But India during this period was linguistically diverse. There were texts in Arabic, in various Indian languages, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Tamil, and dozens of others. Were these vernacular texts preserved as well as Persian ones? Probably not. They were less prestigious, less likely to be carefully maintained in institutional libraries. Their loss rate was likely higher, which means our understanding of the period is skewed toward elite Persian culture and away from vernacular traditions. The bias toward Persian sources shapes how we understand Mughal India. We see it primarily through the lens of courtly culture, of the Persian-using elite. But below this level was a vast world of regional cultures, local traditions, vernacular literary production that has left fewer traces. What was lost in those vernacular languages, regional histories that would give us a different perspective on events we know mainly from court chronicles, poetry in local traditions, different in style and subject from courtly Persian verse, popular literature, stories, folk tales, songs that circulated among ordinary people. All of this existed, but much of it existed only in oral form or in manuscripts that were not carefully preserved. The silence in the historical record is not because these traditions didn't exist, but because they fell through the cracks of preservation. There is also the question of women's writing. Were there women in Mughal India who wrote, who produced texts? Almost certainly yes, particularly in educated elite households. But women's writing was probably preserved at even lower rates than men's because it was not taken as seriously, because women's manuscripts were less likely to end up in institutional collections. We have fragments, tantalizing hints, but whole bodies of work that probably existed have left no trace. Poems written by women in zenanas, family histories maintained by noble women, correspondence between educated women, all of this likely existed but was not valued enough to be systematically preserved. The few examples of women's writing that do survive suggest a rich literary culture that we can only glimpse. The loss of women's voices from the historical record is part of a broader pattern of whose experience gets preserved and whose gets forgotten. The mystery of the lost libraries is not a mystery that can be solved. We cannot reconstruct what has been completely destroyed. But we can recognize the loss, can understand that our knowledge of the past is partial and biased by what happened to survive. The Mughal period we study through surviving texts is not the full Mughal period. It's the version of that period that made it through the filter of preservation. Sometimes, very occasionally, something resurfaces. A manuscript catalogue in an old collection reveals that a text thought lost actually survives. A private collector dies and his manuscripts are examined, and among them is something unexpected. These discoveries are exciting but also sad because they remind us how much remains undiscovered or is simply gone. Each rediscovery prompts speculation about what else might be out there and also grief about what has certainly been lost forever. The excitement of finding a lost manuscript is tempered by the knowledge that it's an exception, that most losses are permanent. Imagine the scholar who spends years searching for a text mentioned in another source, tracking down leads, checking libraries across multiple countries, hoping to find a surviving copy. Sometimes the search succeeds, more often it doesn't, and the scholar has to accept that the text is probably lost permanently, that the questions it might have answered will remain unanswered. The emotional investment in these searches is significant. Years of effort, travel, correspondence with libraries, all in pursuit of a text that may no longer exist. This is the kind of mystery we're exploring in this segment, not a dramatic puzzle with a solution, but a pervasive sense of absence, the knowledge that whole dimensions of the past have slipped away from us. It's appropriate for late-night contemplation, this mixture of beauty in what survives and sadness at what doesn't. The manuscripts that remain are precious partly because they are rare, because we know they are fragile survivors of processes that destroyed most of their companions. When we look at a 17th century illustrated manuscript today, we should see not just its beauty but also its unlikelihood, the many chances it had to be destroyed and somehow wasn't. And we should think about the people who created these manuscripts, the scribes who spent months copying texts, the artists who illuminated margins and painted miniatures, the scholars who wrote the text being copied. They worked with care, producing objects designed to last. They could not have known that most of their work would not survive, that future generations would know their world only through fragments. The gap between their intentions and the reality of what survived is poignant. They created these beautiful objects, hoping they would be read and valued for centuries. And for most manuscripts, that hope was not realized. Perhaps some of them did know, though. Perhaps some scribe in the troubled 18th century, copying a historical chronicle while hearing news of distant battles and collapsing authorities, wondered whether his work would survive the times. Perhaps he added a colophon at the end of the manuscript, a brief note about himself and the circumstances of copying, hoping that some future reader would encounter it and know that he existed. Some manuscripts have such colophons, and reading them across the centuries is always moving, a voice from the past speaking directly to us, bridging the gap of time. These colophons sometimes mention difficulties, shortages of paper, having to work by inadequate light, interruptions from political turmoil. They become inadvertent historical documents, recording the circumstances under which cultural production continued even as the world around the scribe was changing. The East India Company, as it consolidated power in Bengal and elsewhere, initially showed little interest in manuscript collections. The company was a commercial and then administrative organization focused on profit and control, not on preserving Indian cultural heritage. But individual company servants sometimes developed scholarly interests, learned Persian or Sanskrit, began collecting manuscripts. Some of these collections were eventually donated to institutions in Britain, where they remain today. The motivations of these collectors varied. Some were genuine scholars, fascinated by Indian culture and eager to understand it. Others collected manuscripts as curiosities or status symbols, exotic objects that demonstrated their engagement with the Orient. The distinction matters because it affected what was collected and how it was preserved. A serious scholar might carefully catalogue his collection, note provenance and condition, treat the manuscripts with appropriate care. A casual collector might simply accumulate manuscripts without system, valuing them more for their decorative bindings than their content. Both types of collections exist in European libraries, and the history of each manuscript's journey to Europe shapes what we can learn from it today. This creates an odd situation. Some of the most important sources for Indian history from this period are held in libraries in London, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris. To study Mughal India comprehensively, a scholar might need to travel to Europe, to examine manuscripts that were created in India but removed from it during the colonial period. The physical separation mirrors a kind of cultural separation, a split between where texts were created and where they are now preserved. Indian scholars studying their own cultural heritage may need to navigate foreign institutions, obtain permissions, travel thousands of miles to access texts that originated in their own country. Is this loss or preservation? In one sense, these manuscripts survived because they were taken to European libraries with better preservation conditions. In another sense, their removal from India was part of the broader colonial extraction, not of commodities, but of cultural heritage. Both things can be true simultaneously. They survived because they were taken, and taking them was an act of cultural appropriation. The question has no easy answer, but it's worth sitting with the discomfort it produces. Much of what we know about Mughal India we know because company servants and European scholars collected manuscripts and took them to Europe. Without that collection, those manuscripts might have been lost. But the collection itself was part of a process of domination, the assertion that European institutions were more appropriate guardians of Indian culture than Indian institutions. The assertion was often backed by real observations. European libraries did have better preservation conditions, did have professional staff, and systematic cataloguing. But the implicit claim that Indians could not be trusted to preserve their own heritage was both practically based and deeply condescending. As we drift through this consideration of lost libraries and vanished texts, let yourself feel the strange mixture of emotions it evokes. There is beauty in the manuscripts that survive, accomplishment in the craft that created them. There is loss in the knowledge that most did not survive, that whole libraries dissolved into time. There is complexity in understanding that preservation and appropriation were often intertwined, that the survival of texts involved their displacement. This is history as absence, as silence, as the recognition that what we don't know vastly exceeds what we do know. It's fitting subject matter for late night, when the mind is open to contemplating loss and absence, when the certainties of daylight give way to more ambiguous feelings. The ink fades, the paper crumbles, the libraries disperse. But some fragments remain, beautiful and melancholy, testimony to a culture that once produced beauty as a matter of course, and then slowly ceased to have the stability and wealth needed to continue. The East India Company's rise and the Mughal Empire's fall, these processes created conditions where cultural preservation was disrupted, where the ordinary mechanisms that passed knowledge from one generation to the next broke down. The disruption wasn't total, texts continued to be copied, libraries continued to exist, but the scale and security of the system diminished dramatically. And so we have mysteries that will never be solved, texts that will never be read, voices from the past that recorded their thoughts carefully and then fell silent forever. The loss is permanent. We acknowledge it, honor it in the only way now possible, by remembering that it occurred, by recognizing what we don't have, by treating the fragments that remain with the care they deserve. In our digital age, when texts can be reproduced infinitely and storage seems limitless, it's worth contemplating an era when every text was unique, vulnerable, precious in ways we struggle to fully appreciate. Let us now explore a different kind of contrast, one that illuminates the strange historical moment we've been drifting through. We will look at two ways of living, two forms of elite existence, one rooted in the fading Mughal tradition, one emerging from the company's commercial empire. Both are, in their way, unsustainable, both built on illusions that will eventually collapse. First, imagine yourself in the Haveli of a Mughal noble, in Lucknow or Delhi in the 1770s. The noble is not of the highest rank, not a son of the emperor or a major provincial governor, but someone of middle-rank nobility with a title granted by an earlier emperor, estates that provide some income and a position at whatever court still functions. The Haveli is built around courtyards, its architecture reflecting both Persian and Indian influences. The outer courtyard is for guests and public business, with a reception hall where the noble holds audience. The inner courtyards are more private, for family, with rooms arranged around them. The walls are thick, providing some relief from heat. The floors are smooth stone or, in wealthier homes, inlaid marble. The windows are fitted with carved screens that allow air to flow while maintaining privacy. The morning routine begins early, before the heat of the day becomes oppressive. Servants move quietly through the hallways, their footsteps soft on stone. They carry ewers of water for washing, prepare pan and rose water for offering to guests, begin the slow process of cooking the day's meals. The kitchen is separate from the main house to keep smoke and heat away from living spaces, and food must be carried across a courtyard when ready. The noble rises and performs ablutions, then morning prayers if he is observant. His clothes are fine cotton in summer, silk in winter, always elegant. Getting dressed is a process involving servants, the complex wrapping of the turban, the proper arrangement of the shawl over one shoulder, the selection of appropriate jewelry. Every detail matters because appearance is a statement of rank and refinement. Breakfast is a formal affair, even if taken alone. The food is brought on metal trays, arranged with care. There might be fruits, sweetmeats, breads, perhaps some rich dish of meat or vegetables in butter and spices. The noble eats in a measured way. Too much enthusiasm would be undignified. Throughout the day, there will be more meals, each prepared with elaborate care, even though the household's finances might not really support this level of display. The morning might involve meetings with estate managers, though the estate itself is probably producing less revenue than it once did. Zamindari rights are contested, company regulations affect tax collection, and often the noble doesn't fully understand the new administrative systems being imposed. He listens to reports that are probably less optimistic than the manager wants to admit, makes decisions that might or might not be implemented, tries to maintain the fiction of control. Later there might be a poetry gathering, a Mayfill where educated men recite ghazals and debate the finer points of prosody. This is one of the core rituals of Mughal elite culture, poetry in Persian, sometimes in Urdu, exploring themes of love and loss, using elaborate metaphors drawn from a centuries-old tradition. The noble participates either as a poet himself or as an appreciative patron, demonstrating his cultural refinement. The Mayfield takes place in a room designed for such gatherings, with cushions arranged against the walls, proper ventilation, good acoustics. Servants circulate with pan, sherbet, sometimes hashish or opium preparations. The atmosphere is relaxed but also formal, governed by unspoken rules about who speaks when, how criticism is delivered, what level of frankness is appropriate. The poetry is genuinely accomplished. These men have been training in literary composition since childhood, studying classical models, learning the intricate rules of meter and rhyme. The ghazals they produce are sophisticated, beautiful, operating on multiple levels of meaning. But there's also something increasingly archaic about the whole exercise, a sense that this cultural form belongs to a world that is passing away. In the afternoon, the noble might visit other nobles, maintaining the networks of relationship that are essential to his position. These visits follow elaborate protocols. Arriving at someone's house, he is greeted according to his rank, escorted to the appropriate room, offered refreshment. The conversation is formal, touching on safe topics, avoiding anything that might cause offense. Real business, if any occurs, happens through indirection and carefully chosen words. This is a world of immense subtlety, where everything is coded, where direct statement is considered crude. To ask for something outright would be undignified. Instead, one hints, suggests, creates openings that the other person can choose to respond to or not. To refuse something requires equal delicacy. One doesn't say no, one expresses regret at circumstances that make yes impossible. The whole system requires constant attention and considerable social skill, but it's also a system under enormous strain. The economic base that supported this lifestyle is eroding. The estates produce less, the traditional mechanisms of wealth circulation are disrupted, the company's administrative systems create new forms of pressure that this culture is not designed to handle. The nobles continue performing the rituals of refinement, but with increasing difficulty, aware at some level that they're maintaining appearances that no longer correspond to reality. The evening brings more ritual. Another meal, perhaps more elaborate than the earlier ones, with many dishes served in succession. Then music, professional musicians, playing ragas appropriate to the time of day, demonstrating technical virtuosity and emotional expressiveness. The noble listens with the trained appreciation of someone who has been educated in this tradition, who can distinguish subtle variations in performance, who values this music as one of the highest forms of human accomplishment. Later still, preparation for sleep. The servants have already spread bedding in whichever room the noble prefers, perhaps on the roof during hot seasons, in an interior room during winter. They fan him as he lies down, creating air movement in the still night. He falls asleep surrounded by beauty and tradition, but perhaps troubled by anxieties he doesn't fully articulate to himself. The sense that all this is slipping away, that the world is changing in ways that make his entire way of life obsolete. Now shift your attention to a different household, that of a senior company official in Calcutta in the same period. The official is perhaps a member of the council, one of the men who govern Bengal on behalf of the company, or a senior merchant who has made a fortune in trade and tax collection. He lives in a substantial house in the European quarter, built in a style that attempts to transplant English domestic architecture to the Indian climate with mixed success. The house is constructed of brick and plaster, painted white, with a columned portico that gestures toward classical European architecture. Inside, the rooms are large and high-ceilinged, trying to manage heat through space and airflow. The furniture is European, heavy wooden pieces shipped from England or made locally by carpenters working from European models. There are chairs and tables, concepts less common in traditional Indian domestic spaces, where people typically sit on the floor or on low cushions. The official rises early, not from tradition but from necessity. There is work to be done, and the morning hours before the worst heat are the most productive. He dresses in European clothes despite the climate, waistcoat, jacket, breeches, stockings. The clothes are uncomfortable in the heat, but wearing them is a statement of identity, a refusal to go native. Some company men adopt loose Indian clothing at home, but this official maintains European dress as a matter of principle. Breakfast is an English meal or an attempt at one. Bread, butter, perhaps eggs, tea. The tea is Indian, of course, and far better than anything available in England, but the ritual of consumption is English. The official eats while reading correspondence that arrived on recent ships from England, news that is months old by the time he receives it but still represents connection to home. The morning is devoted to paperwork. The company runs on documentation, every transaction recorded, every contract copied, every decision justified in written reports. The official sits at a desk piled with papers, a clerk nearby to make copies, and works through the pile systematically. He signs his name hundreds of times, authorizing payments, approving contracts, acknowledging receipt of reports from subordinate officials in the interior. This is bureaucratic work, methodical and unglamorous. There are no poetry gatherings here, no sophisticated discourse about art and culture. The work is transactional, focused on revenue, on trade, on the countless small decisions required to run a commercial empire. The official might have started his career as a young clerk, learning the business from the ground up, or he might have come to India with connections and money to invest. Either way, his rise has been through competence in this administrative system, through mastering the company's procedures and priorities. Midday brings the main meal, dinner in English terminology, though taken in the afternoon. The food is an odd hybrid, English dishes adapted to Indian ingredients, cooked by Indian servants, following instructions they may not fully understand. The result is often something that satisfies no one, neither properly English nor properly Indian, but it's what's available. Some officials keep Indian mistresses who introduce them to local cuisine, but this official maintains the pretense of English propriety. He dines alone or with other company men discussing business. Conversation focuses on revenue figures, on the behavior of native officials, on news from other company settlements. There is little intellectual content to these conversations. They're practical, focused on problems and solutions, on opportunities for profit. The official knows he's in India to make money, enough to return to England wealthy, to buy an estate, to set himself up as a gentleman. Everything else is subordinate to that goal. The afternoon might involve meetings with Indian officials, the nominal nawab's representatives, zamindars who collect revenue, merchants who deal in the goods the company trades. These meetings are uncomfortable for everyone involved. The company men don't speak the local languages fluently, if at all. They rely on interpreters whose accuracy is questionable. The Indians are navigating a new system whose rules they're still learning, trying to understand what these foreigners want, how to satisfy them, or at least avoid offending them. There is no shared cultural framework for these interactions. The elaborate courtesy of Mughal culture means nothing to the company men who see it as time-wasting. The company's insistence on written contracts and explicit terms violates Indian expectations about how agreements are reached. Both sides are perpetually frustrated with the other, feeling that they're dealing with people who are unreasonable, incomprehensible, possibly dishonest. The official keeps meticulous records of these meetings. Everything must be documented for the company's archives, every transaction justified on paper. He fills ledger after ledger with details, amounts paid, goods transferred, terms agreed to. The ledgers will be reviewed in Calcutta and eventually sent to London, where directors who have never seen India will make decisions based on these abstractions. In the evening, there might be social gatherings with other company men. These are stiff affairs, everyone dressed uncomfortably in European clothes, drinking wine that hasn't survived the sea voyage well, trying to maintain English social rituals in a context where they make no sense. There are toasts to the king, discussions of politics in England, complaints about the climate, and the difficulty of managing Indian subordinates. The official maintains this lifestyle because it represents civilization to him, represents his identity as an Englishman temporarily in India, but not of India. He doesn't want to be here. He finds the climate oppressive, the culture incomprehensible, the whole experience uncomfortable. But he stays because the money is extraordinary, because a few years of service can set him up for life, because opportunities for accumulation that would take decades in England can be accomplished in a few years here. His wealth comes from multiple sources. There's his salary from the company, substantial but not extraordinary. There are legitimate profits from private trading, which company servants are allowed to engage in alongside their official duties. But there are also less legitimate sources, presents from Indian officials that are really bribes, side deals with contractors using his official position to benefit his private business interests. The line between legitimate profit and corruption is blurry, and most company servants cross it repeatedly. The result is wealth accumulation on a scale that would have been impossible in England. Men arrive in India with little and leave 10 or 15 years later with fortunes. They're called nabobs when they return to England, a corruption of nawab, men who've made their money in the East through methods that don't bear too much scrutiny. The official lies awake at night sometimes, in his bed draped with mosquito netting, listening to unfamiliar sounds, insects, distant voices speaking languages he doesn't understand, the call to prayer from a nearby mosque. He thinks about England, about the life he'll return to, about whether the money he's accumulating is worth these years of discomfort and exile. He tells himself it is, that this is temporary, that eventually he'll go home and never think about India again, but he's also anxious. The company's administration is shaky, held together by improvisation and the cooperation of Indian subordinates who could, if they chose, make everything much more difficult. There are risks, disease that could kill him before he accumulates enough to make the experience worthwhile, political changes in London that could undermine the company's position, Indian resistance that could turn violent. He's making money, but he's not secure. Now hold these two images in your mind simultaneously. The Mughal noble in his Haveli, performing rituals of refinement while his economic base crumbles, the company official in his house, accumulating wealth while feeling culturally displaced and insecure. Both are, in different ways, living unsustainably. Both are part of a transition they don't fully understand. The noble represents an old order, a culture of centuries of refinement, a way of life built on assumptions that no longer hold. He believes, or tries to believe, that his status is inherent, that his cultivation matters, that the poetry and music and elaborate courtesy of his world have value beyond their circumstances. But those circumstances are collapsing. The Mughal empire that gave meaning to his entire way of life is dissolving. Within a generation or two, his descendants will either have adapted to the new order or become irrelevant, maintaining the forms of nobility without any of its substance. The company official represents a new order, one based not on hereditary status or cultural refinement, but on commercial success and administrative efficiency. He doesn't care about poetry, he cares about ledgers, about revenue, about measurable outcomes. His power comes not from who he is, but from what he can accomplish, from his position in an organizational structure that spans continents. He's modern in a way the noble is not, oriented toward the future rather than the past. But his modernity is also incomplete and compromised. The company's system is corrupt, extractive, unstable. It's making individuals rich while impoverishing the territories they administer. It's replacing old forms of exploitation with new ones, often harsher because more efficient. The wealth flowing to England is being drained from Bengal's economy, creating conditions that will lead to famines, to immiseration, to social breakdown. Neither of these men is fully aware of the larger patterns they're part of. The noble doesn't see that his entire culture is being made obsolete, that the Mughal world is ending not in a dramatic collapse but in a slow fade into irrelevance. The official doesn't see that he's part of a system of extraction that will eventually have to be justified and reformed, that the casual corruption and exploitation of his era will become embarrassments to later generations. They occasionally interact, these two types. A company official might attend a mahfil at an Indian noble's invitation, might sit through poetry recitation he doesn't understand, might accept pan and sherbet, and make polite conversation through an interpreter. The noble sees the official as crude, uncultured, powerful in the way that barbarians are sometimes powerful. The official sees the noble as effete, impractical, living in the past. Both assessments contain truth. The Mughal culture is backward-looking, obsessed with maintaining forms and traditions that no longer serve practical purposes. The company culture is Philistine, lacking any deeper values beyond profit, unable to appreciate or even recognize forms of human achievement that don't translate into commercial success. The future belongs to the company, but something valuable is being lost in the transition. Consider the treatment of art and learning in these two worlds. The noble patronizes poets and musicians, not as a luxury, but as an essential part of civilization, as what makes life worth living beyond mere survival. He's been educated to appreciate these arts, to understand them as humanity's highest achievements. When he listens to a raga performed by a master musician, he experiences something he would consider spiritual, a connection to beauty and tradition and meaning. The company official has no framework for this. If he attends a musical performance, he's bored, finds it monotonous, wonders when it will end so he can get back to business. He might appreciate European music if any were available, but this Indian music just sounds strange to him, all the notes in the wrong places, going on far too long. He doesn't understand that his inability to appreciate it represents a limitation, a narrowing of human experience to what can be quantified and commercialized. Yet the noble's world is ending and the official's is rising. Why? Not because one is morally superior to the other. Both are, in their ways, morally compromised. The company system is more ruthlessly exploitative than anything in the Mughal tradition, its violence more systematic, even if less visible. But it's also more effective at organizing power, at coordinating action across distance, at converting resources into capability. The Mughal system was built on personal relationships, on networks of loyalty and obligation that worked well when stable but fragmented under pressure. The company system is built on impersonal procedures, on rules that apply regardless of personal connection, on documentation that outlasts individual actors. When the two systems compete, the impersonal one has advantages. It's more predictable, more scalable, more robust against disruption. This is worth contemplating as we drift through this late hour. Historical transitions often involve the replacement of older, more humane systems with newer, more efficient ones. Efficiency wins, but at a cost. The world becomes more productive, but also more alienating, more powerful, but also more mechanical. Something is gained, but something is also lost, and the loss might not be fully recognized for generations. The noble's household maintains traditions of hospitality, of generosity, of aesthetic refinement. These are genuine values, not just pretensions. When a visitor arrives, they're treated with elaborate courtesy, offered the best the household can provide, made to feel honored. This hospitality might be economically irrational, the household can't really afford it, but it represents a commitment to values beyond calculation. The company official's household operates on different principles. Hospitality is limited to those who might be useful, who represent business opportunities or political connections. There's a transactional quality to every interaction, an unspoken calculation of costs and benefits. This is more sustainable economically, but it represents a narrowing of human relationship to what can be extracted from it. Which world is better? The question is almost meaningless because we're not choosing between static options. We're watching a process of historical change that isn't driven by collective choice but by the grinding interaction of systems and circumstances. The Mughal world is dying not because people decided it should die, but because it can't adapt fast enough to new pressures. The company world is rising not because it's morally superior, but because it's structurally more effective at this historical moment. The people caught in this transition, and millions are caught in it, mostly don't understand what's happening. They see their immediate circumstances, make local decisions, try to survive and perhaps prosper. The noble tries to maintain his status, the official tries to accumulate wealth, the villager we met in the first segment tries to pay taxes to whoever seems most threatening. None of them sees the full pattern, the long arc of change that's reshaping everything. By the 1770s and 1780s, the pattern is becoming clearer to some observers. The company has moved beyond being just a trading concern. It now administers Bengal, collecting tens of millions of rupees in revenue annually, maintaining an army of tens of thousands, governing a population larger than many European states. It's becoming a state itself, though one of a strange new type, a commercial corporation that happens to govern territories. The Mughal emperor in Delhi still exists, still holds his court, still performs the rituals of sovereignty. But everyone knows his authority is hollow. The provincial governors don't obey him, the company doesn't acknowledge his supremacy, except in the most formal and meaningless ways, and even in Delhi itself, his power extends barely beyond the palace walls. He's become a symbol without substance, a name invoked in coins and prayers, but signifying nothing. Some of the Mughal nobles see this clearly and make their accommodation with the new order. They learn to deal with company officials, learn the new administrative systems, find ways to preserve some status and income within the changing structure. Others retreat into denial, insisting that the old ways are the only ways, that this company ascendancy is temporary and the natural order will reassert itself. That reassertion never comes. The company officials, for their part, are often contemptuous of Indian culture, but also sometimes fascinated by it. A few learn Persian or Sanskrit, study Indian history and philosophy, try to understand the civilization they're in the process of subjugating. These are the exceptions, the men who will later be called Orientalists, who will produce grammars and dictionaries and translations. Most officials remain culturally isolated, counting the days until they can return to England. The wealth extracted from India flows to England and reshapes it too. The fortunes made by nabobs by estates fund businesses, enter the English economy. The textiles produced by Indian weavers compete with English domestic production, causing disruption and eventually leading to protective policies. The spices and tea and other goods flow through British ports, generating revenue and employment. India's subordination is becoming integral to Britain's economy, making future independence less likely. Meanwhile, in the villages and towns of India, life continues with its difficulties and small pleasures. Most people are barely aware of these larger transitions. They know that rules keep changing, that new officials keep appearing with new demands, that life keeps getting slightly harder. They don't know they're living through the transition from one empire to another, through a historical moment that later generations will study and debate. At night, in the noble's haveli, the lamps are lit with oil pressed from seeds, casting a soft golden light. Music drifts from one of the courtyards, a sarangi playing a slow, meditative raga. Servants move quietly, their presence barely noticed by the family members they serve. Everything is ordered, beautiful, governed by centuries of tradition, and everything is slowly collapsing, though no one wants to acknowledge it. At night, in the company official's house, lamps are also lit, perhaps with better quality oil imported from England. The official sits at his desk, even at this late hour, working through paperwork by lamplight. His eyes hurt from the strain, his back aches from sitting, but the work must be done. There are reports to write, accounts to balance, letters to compose. He's building something new, though he doesn't quite understand what. He thinks he's just making money, but he's actually participating in the construction of a new form of empire. Both houses will eventually fall, the nobles through economic decay and social obsolescence, the company officials through the eventual end of company rule, and the transition to formal British colonial administration. But that's still decades away. For now, both exist simultaneously, two ways of living uneasily sharing the same territory, representatives of different eras that haven't yet resolved their competition. This is the essential strangeness of the period we've been exploring, that it's caught between orders, that the old has not yet fully died, and the new has not yet fully formed. People live in this ambiguity, trying to navigate a world where the rules are unclear, where authority is contested, where the future is impossible to predict with any confidence. The contrast between these two worlds illuminates what was happening to India as a whole. An old imperial system based on personal rule, cultural prestige, and traditional hierarchies was giving way to a new system based on bureaucratic administration, commercial extraction, and documented procedures. The transition was slow, uneven, painful for millions. It created opportunities for some and disaster for others. It was, in the end, neither chosen nor avoidable. It was simply what happened when these particular historical forces collided in this particular place at this particular time. And the people living through it, noble and official, villager and soldier, scribe and merchant, they were all just trying to make sense of their circumstances, to survive, to perhaps prosper, to protect what they valued. They didn't know they were historical actors in a drama that would be studied for centuries. They were simply living their lives day by difficult day in a world that was changing around them faster than they could adapt. We have traveled a long road together through this quiet night, haven't we? We began in the villages, in the daily struggle of ordinary people trying to survive in a world that was slowly becoming more difficult and confusing. We moved through Mir Jafar's tragic life, watching a man make choices that seemed reasonable at the moment, but led to powerlessness and regret. We drifted among lost libraries and vanished manuscripts, contemplating the fragility of cultural memory. And we ended by contrasting two ways of living, two forms of elite existence, each unsustainable in its own way. What connects all these threads is the nature of the transition India was experiencing in the 18th century. This was not conquest in the traditional sense, not armies sweeping across territory in dramatic campaigns that could be marked on maps with clear dates. This was something slower and stranger, the gradual replacement of one form of organization with another, the quiet accumulation of small advantages that eventually added up to domination. The East India Company took over India through paperwork and patience, through contracts and corruption, through the methodical exploitation of weaknesses in existing systems. They didn't defeat the Mughal Empire in battle, they simply made themselves indispensable, positioned themselves as the solution to problems that were often of their own making, and gradually converted commercial relationships into political control. This kind of conquest is harder to see while it's happening, harder to resist, because it doesn't present itself as conquest at all. It appears as trade agreements, as loans to help cash-strapped rulers, as administrative improvements, as mutually beneficial arrangements. Only in hindsight does the pattern become clear, does it become obvious that each small step was leading toward comprehensive subjugation. The people who lived through this transition, the millions of ordinary Indians trying to make their way in an increasingly chaotic world, mostly didn't understand what was happening to them. They experienced the symptoms, taxes increasing and becoming more unpredictable, authority fragmenting among competing claimants, old certainties dissolving without clear replacements. But they couldn't see the larger pattern, couldn't know they were living through the end of one era and the beginning of another. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of major historical changes. They often happen too slowly for those experiencing them to fully recognize what's occurring. Each year is only slightly different from the previous year. Each small change seems manageable, and it's only when you look back across decades that you realize how completely everything has transformed. Think about the person we imagined in the first segment, grinding grain in the pre-dawn darkness, weaving cloth for merchants whose network stretched beyond imagining, trying to navigate between multiple tax collectors who each claimed legitimacy. That person was living through history, through the Mughal decline, through the company's rise, through a transition that would reshape the entire subcontinent. But from their perspective, it was just a difficult life, harder than their parents had been, uncertain in ways that prevented planning or hope. Or think about Mir Jafar making his fateful decision to ally with the company against his nawab. He thought he was securing a throne, achieving the highest rank available to him, making a choice that would guarantee his family's position. He couldn't know he was participating in a pattern that would repeat across India, that the company would use the same strategy again and again, finding disaffected nobles and using them to insert itself into local power structures. His personal tragedy was also a structural inevitability. Or consider the manuscripts slowly deteriorating in neglected libraries, the scribal traditions dying out, the cultural memory being lost. This wasn't a deliberate destruction. No one was burning libraries or executing scholars. It was simply the result of systems breaking down, of patronage drying up, of the institutions that maintained cultural continuity losing their funding and purpose. The loss was enormous, but it happened quietly, almost invisibly, one decaying manuscript at a time. What we've explored tonight is really a meditation on how empires end and begin, on how historical transitions work, on the gap between the large patterns visible to historians and the immediate experience of people living through those patterns. The Mughal Empire's fall and the company's rise happened simultaneously, were in fact two aspects of the same process. But they felt different depending on where you stood, what your circumstances were, what you knew and couldn't know. There's something both tragic and oddly comforting about this recognition. Tragic because it reveals how powerless individuals often are in the face of large historical forces, how much suffering can be caused by processes no one consciously chose or controlled. Comforting because it removes the illusion of control, the burden of thinking that better choices would have led to better outcomes. Sometimes historical forces are too large, too complex, too overdetermined for individual or even collective agency to redirect them. The world we live in now is the descendant of these transitions. The British Empire that would formerly rule India for nearly 2 centuries had its origins in this period, in the company's patient accumulation of power through the mid-18th century. The administrative systems, the economic relationships, the cultural attitudes, all were being formed in these decades we've been contemplating. History isn't past, it echoes forward, shaping present circumstances in ways we often don't recognize. But that's too large a thought for this late hour. Better to let it rest, to return our attention to something simpler and more immediate. Let yourself feel the comfort of where you are now, in a room with solid walls, with light available at the touch of a switch, with access to clean water and abundant food. These are comforts that the people we've been imagining could hardly dream of, luxuries beyond anything available to Mughal nobles or company officials. You don't have to grind grain before dawn or weave cloth until your fingers bleed. You don't have to navigate between competing tax collectors or worry that bandits will rob you on the road. You don't have to live through the collapse of empires or the uncertainty of not knowing who holds authority. The hard times we've been exploring are long past, survived by our ancestors, transformed into history that we can contemplate from a position of safety. Let that recognition bring a sense of peace. The struggles were real, the suffering was real, but they're over now. The people who lived through them did the best they could with the circumstances they were given. They endured, they adapted, they survived long enough to have descendants, some of whom might be listening to this now. Their lives mattered, even if history forgot most of their names, even if they never achieved anything that would be recorded in chronicles or remembered in poetry. The slow collapse of the Mughal world, the quiet rise of the East India Company, these vast historical processes were made up of millions of individual lives, each one experienced from the inside as the only life there was, each one full of hopes and fears, and daily struggles. We've tried tonight to touch some of those individual experiences, to feel what it might have been like to live in that transitional moment, to inhabit a world that was changing in ways no one fully understood. And now, having made this long journey together, it's time to let it all drift away. The villages along the Ganges, the courts at Murshidabad, the libraries slowly dispersing, the contrasting households of noble and official, let them all recede into the past where they belong. You visited them, walked through their spaces, contemplated their dilemmas, but you don't live there. You live here now in a different world with different challenges. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel yourself sinking into whatever surface supports you. The weight of your body, the rhythm of your breath, the small sounds of the night around you, these are real, immediate, present. The past we've been exploring exists only in memory and imagination now, preserved in fragments, interpreted and reinterpreted by each generation. Let your breathing slow, let your thoughts drift and scatter. There's nothing more you need to do tonight, nowhere else you need to be. The history will still be there tomorrow if you want to return to it. For now, just rest. Let sleep come when it's ready, natural and gentle, carrying you away from all these stories of struggle and transition into the peaceful darkness where nothing needs to be understood or remembered. The Mughal world ended, the company's world ended in its turn, and other worlds will end in the future. But sleep is older than any empire, more fundamental than any historical transition. It claims everyone equally, noble and peasant, merchant and scribe, offering the same oblivion to all. Let it claim you now, easily and completely, carrying you beyond history into the timeless space where consciousness dissolves and the weary body finally gets its rest. Good night.